Hey folks, this is an excerpt from Discovering People, a podcast about lives and stories. It's a conversation series about the question, how did we get here? Each episode is a deep portrait of a different person's worldviews and biography. I want this podcast to inspire empathy and understanding. I hope that by encountering strangers in this way, you can discover insights and perspectives for your own life, one episode at a time. In this episode, I talk to Mariam, who is a service provider in the horror industry. The link to the full episode is in the description. So I would like to loop back to something that you said earlier that I think we can go into a little deeper. That is truly interesting to me. And it's horror as a coping mechanism. Because you said most people who like horror have survived something. And I found that certainly true for myself. And I found that true for people I know. Like it's funny. Like it's a gut feeling. It's not even a mental. It's not even the thing that I think about first. But it's just a gut feeling. It's like when I meet somebody and they like horror. There's something there. There's something that makes them more interesting to me. There's something that I can. I don't know why. Like I feel like there's some sort of intellectual challenge that I can live with these people, some sort of intellectual experience that it might be me just being conceited or something, or just full of myself because I like horror. But I kind of got that impression that that's certainly true, that what you said, most people who like horror have survived something. And I want to go into that a little deeper. Why would you say that? Like, how's your experience shown you that? I mean, your personal experience, I guess, is the sleep. Jesus, why am I not thinking of the word?
Paralysis.
Sleep paralysis.
I mean, amongst other things, I
Yeah.
think I had quite a few challenges growing up as well that we don't need to dive into, but definitely not the easiest of starts in life. And I think to comment on what you were saying about meeting someone and feeling like, you can somehow relate to them. It takes a particular personality type to say, I like horror films. Like, even if you've seen a horror film that you liked, you might say, oh, I liked Get Out, but you won't say, I like horror films. So to say I like horror films means, you've seen horror films and you are drawn to them. And to be that kind of person, you need to have some sort of desensitization to things, which is usually also a result of confrontation to certain subject matter. A lot of people are also still hung up on the stigma that horror films are really just about sexism and blood, and that is baloney.
Yeah.
Because horror films, there is such a vast array of horror films that you can watch, and while some of them will be about chicks with big boobs running through a puddle of blood, that is what they wanted to do, and that they are entitled to make that kind of film, and you are entitled to watch it. But there's more to horror than that. And a lot of horror filmmakers are interested in a lot of very different things, and put that in their movies. So the question is, why is horror a coping mechanism? Now, I'm not a professor,
Yeah.
or even expert is relative, but you have to imagine that you are in a safe environment. So let's say you are in your living room, or even usually a movie theater, or these days a drive-in, but it's a safe environment. And suddenly you have 1 to 2 hours of tension and fear and what feels like life-threatening circumstances. And then suddenly it's over and you turn it off and you're still safe.
Yeah.
So it's about experiencing something that's adrenaline inducing and emotion inducing in a controlled environment.
Yeah.
So that already helps you, kind of like what we were saying about dreams before, kind of do practice runs with lots of different emotions in a safe environment without real life consequences, as long as your maturity level or what you're capable of processing matches what you consume, which is why I'm still very much an advocate of not every horror film is for every horror fan, and it's good that there are also age restrictions on certain stuff. But again, as long as you follow certain guidelines, it's safe and you're safe afterwards. You might go to bed and you might get, as the Germans say, Kopfkino, or literally translated head cinema, hence the name of my company, Head Cinema Projections. But in the end, when it's gone, you're still safe. It's really just your mind kind of taking you for a ride, and it's something you can learn to process. But the coping mechanism it doesn't stop there. It comes from the fact that many of the films that dive into really tough issues and topics, they are often a way for filmmakers to process things as well.
Yeah.
It could be the fear of the dark, and it could be the loss of a child. There are lots of different, really hardcore topics.
It's funny. It took me a long time to realize that Indiana Jones and Star Wars, and even Starship Troopers, was ways of directors from that generation to process the Nazi regime. I mean, it was so obvious when you think about it, like obviously Schindler's List that's of course what it's about, but even in Star Wars, you have like all the imagery, they have all that reverberating, the whole fascism,
the foreign thing as well, and the fascism.
You have that reverberating through these movies, and it took me a while. I mean, it's on the nose in Indiana Jones. I mean, the Nazis are there, and in Starship Troopers, it's just brilliantly disguised. You need to look a little closer to understand what this movie is about. But I find that this is filmmakers processing what they learned, right, about what happened, because like they were born in Paul Verhoeven, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. They were all, I would guess, I would have to look it up, but born in the 40s, give or take, right? So the war was just over, and then when they were 20 something in the 60s, all the shit came out that actually the Nazis did, and they were processing that, and it took me a while to realize, wait a minute, that's what they were doing in their movies. They were creating great entertainment, but it was for them a way to deal with that.
Well. Anything that's horror, sci-fi, or even fantasy, but anything that seems so surreal and distant from life is really packaging something else. Another famous example for that is the show The Twilight Zone, which came out, mid-century, whatever. And when it was originally pitched, it had nothing to do with everything that makes it the show we know it to be now. It was supposed to be socially critical, and it was supposed to be a commentary on human and society in terms of its, behavior and nature. And they didn't want to produce it. But once the creators said, okay, well, it's going to be weird though. It's going to have aliens and monsters and supernatural elements, are like, oh, that's a cool show. But that's why you look at the episodes now and they all have social commentary, because that was the initial point of the show, but it didn't get approved until it became weird, and then it was approved. But, returning back to this processing of stuff, when you are an audience member and then you watch these really serious issues wrapped in a horror film, if you have been through very tragically that particular thing yourself, then it's helping you overcome it in a different facet of your life, or at least feel like other people get your pain, your fear, and that can give you a sense of, even a faint sense of reassurance. But simultaneously, if you haven't been through that, and you're watching a film about something that you can't personally relate to, it also gives you a sense of empathy, because it's giving you that feeling that someone else had. And even if it's in an artistic form, and it has to be, because sometimes it doesn't hit closely enough to home if you just talk about it happening, especially even more than ever these days with the internet. We read horrible headlines all the freaking time. So the the sober information is not enough for us to feel anything anymore, because we're used to hearing about accidents where people die tragically or lose their homes. Like, we hear it and we just go, just another day on planet Earth. But to watch a film where it's focused down and we magnify the emotions, even if it is metaphorical, we magnify the emotions of someone in a specific situation, we only then sometimes can understand what it means to go through that particular fear or tragedy. And it helps us cultivate empathy, which is something that true horror fans, that is probably what you're connecting to. There's an openness to other lives and other stories, and there's a genuine interest. It's not like, oh, how are you doing? It's like, wow, how did it make you feel? What was it like? What did you do? What are you going to do about it? People are genuinely interested in the stories of other people. It's in the nature of someone who is drawn. It's like, well, chicken or the egg kind of situation. Are you drawn to those movies because you're that person, or do you become that person because you're drawn to those movies? But it's a really interesting way to go about it, and it definitely helps us process things and move forward.
Somebody might just respond to you now, it's easier than that. I just watched a horror movie, it scared me, I don't like being scared. But then at the same time,
film
could be. But then at the same time, a lot of people go through life and they don't like horror movies. They never watch them. They're perfectly fine. They also don't judge people who like horror movies, that's I think is the core. Like that, everybody obviously has every right to like and dislike what they like or dislike, and you can make a case for horror movies and say, what, give it a try. You might find something very intellectually stimulating. It might open your mind. It might expand your horizons a little. But people choose not to, and they're perfectly fine nonetheless. The problem, of course, is if I get judged for what my hobby is. Like, if somebody judges me because I like horror movies, then that's I don't think that's fair. But then, like I'm saying,
but hold
somebody
on,
might just say,
going to comment on that real quick before you continue, because the problem is mostly the stigma, and there are a lot of films that people watch and they're not aware that they're horror films. I mean, if you think of films like Alien or Jurassic Park, guess what? Those are horror films.
Yeah,
and a lot of people who say, I don't watch horror films, will still have seen Jurassic Park because it's Jurassic Park.
Yeah, and that's
and
a
it's
horror
like,
film.
are you aware? But I remember going into a bookstore here in Germany, and it was a really nice bookstore. I like going to bookstores. They smell great. I like grabbing a coffee. I like just seeing what's out there and then taking something home with me. And this was like, and obviously, whether it's like a big bookstore that belongs to a chain or something small and independent, I like supporting them all, spreading those oats, if you will. But I was in an independent small bookshop, and I really liked it. It was cozy, and they had lots of different books. And then I asked someone who worked there, like, hey, do you also do horror books? And she just was so dismissive, and she says, no, we don't sell that kind of thing here.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, wait, so you only have the crime novels about murder, but you don't have Victorian ghost stories?
Yeah.
And she was like, I'm like, no, it's okay, I know now. And that's the thing. It's like a lot of people who, for example, will read a crime novel, which is, to me, way closer to reality and actual horrible things.
You know what? Yeah.
But horror, because they think horror is whatever they think it is, and they will just dismiss it so horribly. And I'm like, you are aware of the hypocrisy, right?
Yeah. It's funny because yesterday I started rewatching Columbo with my girlfriend, and I watched it when I was a kid, and dubbed in German, and then like I think in 2009 or something, I bought the DVD sets and I watched it in English. And then yesterday we started again, and we watched the first episode. And the cold-blooded way the murderer plots his murder, like what he's going to do, and then the way he kills his wife. it is pretty, like, it's set up pretty. They take their time. They introduce the whole thing. They introduce his plot. They introduce what he's going to do, and it is pretty
Dark.
intense. It's dark and
Yeah.
intense, and that's Columbo.
Yeah.
Like that's a crime TV show that you can show any kid that's like after above the age of 7, 8, 9 years, they can watch Columbo.
Yeah.
Totally.
Exactly.
But it
And
is at its core. That's a pretty dark thing that happens in that
yeah.
show.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think, first of all, we need to kind of let go of the stigmas, and we need to honestly reflect what it is we're saying and what it is we're talking about, and claim to know what we're talking about. I mean, that's generally always a thing. Question everything. Question what other people say, question what you think,
Yeah.
and just be clever and logical about it. But then when it comes to like violence, there is such a big difference between fiction and reality. And before I start like forbidding horror films, I am more likely to hit the streets and ask for schools to hire psychologists to do
Absolutely.
psych evaluations of students.
Because that what needs to happen. Like, we need to care more for people, and like, sorry, I mean, there's one solution that's easy, and there's one solution that requires a lot of patience and effort.
Yeah.
And the latter is the right one. The easy one is saying,
Exactly.
yeah, ban horror movies. But sorry, that's not. No, you're not helping that way.
You have to be somehow not stable, not quite balanced human being to actually commit a crime,
Yeah.
and not understand that what you're consuming as a medium is fiction.
Mm.
I know that there are, especially older horror films, where it's kind of a weird line to cross, because especially, a few decades ago, animal cruelty, actual animal
Oh my God,
cruelty,
yeah.
was an element of horror films, and we don't like that these days.
Yeah.
You're not really allowed to anymore. And a lot of horror fans say, I don't care if it's a classic, I refuse to watch this movie
Yeah,
because
same here,
of that.
actually.
And that's where you blur the lines a little bit, like Cannibal Holocaust or whatever.
Yeah.
But to these days, it's regulated. It's kind of like, if it's legal, it has to be regulated, and it's all fiction. It's all fiction. And as long as, don't be afraid of the people who are talking about the fictional aspect of violence. Be more afraid of the people who are not talking about it, because God knows what they do behind closed doors. And it's really important to find the actual problems, and the actual problems don't start when you watch a movie. For someone to actually commit a violent crime, and not regard the rest as fiction, but as inspiration or a playbook or whatever you want to call it, that person is already messed up.
Yeah.
And there's something in their real life that, even if they've never committed the crime before, is lurking under the surface and is waiting to explode. And that person needs help that goes beyond the TV they watch. So, yeah, anyway,
yeah, totally.
that's my opinion on it.